In the Bible, First Timothy says no woman should have authority over a man and should keep silent in church, and presumably at home too. First Corinthians also says women should keep silent, and also, by the way, that women should have long hair and men short hair. We've got to keep those stereotypes going. Some churches ban women from leadership positions, especially the clergy, based on these passages. Other churches don't, and will point out that the Bible also lifts up a number of women in leadership, especially in the Jesus movement, including Priscilla and Tabitha. So what exactly are we supposed to believe about women in the church? Well, welcome back to Unfolding Wings, the holiest podcast out there, because it's hosted by me, the sort of holy pastor, and some other cool cats from Charlton City UMC. We don't have Diego here with us, but we do have Kayla, and she's what matters, so say hi.
Hi.
All right, great to have you with us as always, and we are here to help young adults like ourselves, especially young adults, but any adult really, but especially young adults, faithfully explore topics and questions important and relevant to a well-lived life, so we can all unfold our wings and live out our faith in the way God calls each of us to do. Now, let me remind us that we aren't necessarily representing our own views or those of the church, just having an open conversation so that we can all faithfully explore. So please listen with an open mind, just as we are having an open mind in our conversation. Now, before we begin, I want to point out that my young adult co-hosts are currently truly representing the lives of many young adults out there right now. I did not ask them ahead of time if I could say this, so I hope it's okay. But Kayla just moved into a new apartment because her previous landlord was less than exceptional, and she's now working a second job to compensate. And Diego is looking forward to starting up his medical residency, which not a lot of people do, but finishing studies with debt to pay off later is something a lot of us do. And in the midst of those life struggles, we still have some of these large life questions to handle. It's not like we can just put life to the side while we're having to navigate these difficult conversations. Now, today we're obviously talking about whether women can be leaders in the church. It might be hard for some to believe. This episode isn't just about how we interpret certain passages from the Bible. It is still a current event topic. Now, we are filming at the beginning of May 2023, and just 2 months ago, 5 churches were expelled from the Southern Baptist Convention for having female pastors. Southern Baptists are one of the largest Christian denominations in our country, and they're not the only ones who still today do not believe in having female church leadership. The big one, as you might know, Roman Catholics still do not believe in female church leadership. Many non-denominational Christian churches, as well as any individual who reads the Bible literally, thinks women shouldn't be church leaders. So forget about pastors. Some don't even think that women should have any leadership position whatsoever. Now, many young adults are target audience. Man, I'm having trouble talking already. So, Kayla, you're going to have to do the heavy lifting here. But many young adults will currently be in or have been raised in a church or family that teaches that women should not be church leaders and should be subservient to their husbands at home. Some may have rejected that belief and in the process turned away from God and church altogether, thinking that probably all organized Christian churches are unjust. Now, that's the national and global climate that we're in. Our more local climate, those of us here and now recording this podcast, I think it's safe to say, even if Diego were here, that we're all agreed that women can be leaders in the church. Am I right about that? Do we agree about that?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And of course, you've mentioned before that your mother is a pastor, so you better believe it, or else holidays would be rough. You know what? Our script had me saying a whole bunch more things before I actually invited a conversation. So let's scrap that idea. Let me ask you, first of all, why do you think so many people today still believe that women cannot be church leaders?
I mean, there's a lot of people that take the Bible literally or still follow something that's like super old and outdated. And also just like, just throwing like sexism into the picture. I feel like we've come a long way and to think that you can't be a woman and lead. Or I mean, for this, these are like probably the same people that think that it's not okay to be gay. So it's like people are
Mm.
stuck in like, really old, outdated mindsets that I think we need to move past to become more loving and inclusive.
Yeah, and that made me think too. You said we um, kind of been taught that women can't lead. It's not just in the church either. And the sexism thing. Um, when Hillary Clinton was running for president, it was often, hey, her voice isn't, I don't like it. So she shouldn't be president. Or, women can't be presidents because they don't have a backbone. Um, Don Lemon, formerly of CNN, recently said about Nikki Haley that she's not in her prime because she's over 40, and like as if that's means she can't be president. No matter what we think about these people, that kind of sexist thinking about women in leadership still pervades our conversation and our thinking, whether we acknowledge it or not. Um, and I know some friends of mine have experienced that as they try to move up the ranks, so to speak. Have you experienced it at all in your own? Not that you are striving to be CEO or anything, but
I mean, for sure, I'm not, I don't think I've ever disclosed where I work, so I'm gonna hopefully say this without
sure.
getting in trouble. But, you know, I was looking for more money for the job that I'm doing because I feel like I'm not being paid adequately enough for the job. And I started asking around the men and women, like my coworkers, what they're making. And I found it to be that the men were making more. So I'm just like, okay, there's positions here that we're doing the same job and the guys are being paid more to do it. And it's just like, I feel like women are taught to be silent and just accept what they're given instead of like fighting for more because we're scared of what, can be said. But thankfully, I'm raised by a woman who's a leader who pushes me, and my dad too. I mean, he's always been that way. Um, they've both pushed me to strive for more and not to be scared, especially in the face of sexism or racism, whatever it may be. But I definitely have faced those hardships, and I know that I have a right to ask and demand what I believe I'm worth, and I think that everyone else should too, regardless of gender or race, um, or religion, whatever it may be. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, because this is a little bit like off topic, but it always reminds me of this when I'm thinking of like women in powers. I always think of the Book of Esther. That's like my favorite story in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like I just find it to be such a powerful story because she also goes through like what I just said, being scared to say what she feels she needs to say, and maybe that her voice is not as important as it should be, or that she won't be taken seriously because she's a woman. And I think that, I mean, like the story just plays out so beautifully. I really love that story, to know that she, against her fear and whatever else obstacles are in her way, she goes forward to the king and, demands to save the Jews. So I just like, it's stuff like that. Like that's a biblical story, and for someone to tell women that they cannot be leaders in the church. I mean, you look at the mother of Jesus, like she's so revered in different religions, and you're going to tell them that they can't lead. That just doesn't make sense. I mean, women are the ones birthing people, like whole humans. We're the ones that raise people. We raise men and women to become who they are. And to say that, especially for a man to turn around and say that a woman can't lead, it's like, bro, just remember where you came from. Like, what's wrong with you? So,
Yeah, no, I mean, good point. And so I've taken notes. Hopefully, we'll come back to some of these things. But I think that the point about Esther, especially, is well made because a lot of women are put in that position of either, or they feel like the choices are speak up and get fired, or just deal with less pay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's one of the reasons why many businesses don't publish the earnings of their employees to as a means of keeping women silent, because they know, you know, if they publish the earnings, the only people who are going to be upset are the women because they're still making significantly less to the dollar of men. But Esther did eventually speak up, and the famous phrase from that book is, "Perhaps you were born for such a time as this." So perhaps such a time as this is the time for you to speak up. And so I hope, especially if there are female young adults listening to this experiencing sexism in the workplace or in the church, that you look to Esther. We have to admit, though, that the process of getting to equality and egalitarianism between men and women, whether it's in the church or the workplace, is a work in progress. It's going to take a while. Things don't change overnight. It's the same thing with racism. Just because the civil rights movement happened 70 years ago doesn't mean suddenly everything is better. And in Christian history, unfortunately, even though there have been some radical movements, and even though, as we've already said, the Bible mentions women leaders, generally speaking, it was only in the late 1700s and early 1800s that women began pressing for their right to preach and lead. And some church traditions, only some, gave them that right, but always opposition to women preaching and leading was strong. And like the opposition to including black people, I mean, sexism and racism are very similar. The opposition was based both in the Bible and in general prejudices. So we could ask whether sexism came first and drives our interpretation of the Bible, or our interpretation of the Bible drives sexism. No chicken or egg, but perhaps sexism is what comes first. Because with or without certain texts in the Bible, there remains that sexism in the church. We have to be honest about that. Even in a progressive church, it's still there. And we talked about how women still make less than men do, and that's also in the church. So here in the New England Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, many think it's a progressive conference. Um, I know of at least one couple, both husband and wife are pastors. They've been pastors for just as long, but the husband's pension, which is directly tied to salary, is about twice the amount of his wife's pension. So that's saying something. And I heard on the radio one time a pastor defending his church's stance not allowing female leadership by saying something like, "Hey, I'm a feminist too. I love women. I love my wife. My wife is my queen. All women deserve everything. They deserve to be put on pedestals. They deserve not have to work. Let me do the hard work and I'll just take care of you. You just be at home because you're my queen." And I just feel like ick, right? As if that's not sexism. So anyway, before we get back to the Bible, you know, just how much do we think sexism has affected our understanding of the Bible, or do we think it was the Bible that came first that drove sexism? What do you think?
No, I'm sure that sexism has been around for before the time of the Bible. I just think like I mean, I guess I really don't know, but like Bible's pretty old, but even still that was curated and created later on. So I would say that sexism was definitely around before that. I mean, you have tradition, you have culture that plays a huge part. You have just so many things that play into it, because I know that even within my own family, or even in other communities, you have like either patriarch driven or matriarch driven cultures. Um, and so I think like both garner respect. I also want to add like, the whole thing about like being a stay-at-home wife and not having to work and just raising the kids and cleaning the kitchen and all that. Like obviously I would not want to do that. And but to have the choice to choose whether or not I want to do that is what I think is important. Because I think there are some women that that enjoy being at home. They don't want to work. They'd rather be home raising kids. And there's some women I've met that I'm just like, they're stay at home, they're raising their kids, they're so happy, and that's something that really brings them joy and fulfills them. And I think that it's great to have the choice to want to do that. So I think that's what like it really boils down to, whether or not, because you can have stay at home dads and
Yep.
they should have also the choice to want to do that too. I don't think that being a man or a woman should have to play a part in whether or not we stay at home and cook dinner and clean the kitchen and do the dishes and change the kid's diaper, or be the one that wakes up in the middle of the night to be with the kid. Like I just um that kind of stuff just like drives me nuts, like the whole gender role situations. And we know that that's been around forever, right? Because the men always go out, they were either hunting and the women were home feeding the kids, cooking, whatever. um I think that's just been around forever. And of course, when you tie religion to anything, it's multiplied, I feel like, because then it's like you're either doing it this way and you're being like this holy religious person, and if not, then you're sinning and you're a bad Christian. So I feel like people like to use that excuse to say like, oh well, I'm the one that goes out and works, my wife is the one that takes care of everything because I told her to, and that's the way it has to be done, and she needs to respect me. And I feel like a lot of people lose context in that, because I mean the wife, sure, she needs to honor her husband, right? But the husband also needs to honor his wife and respect his wife and love his wife. So it's just like I feel like people just like stop at that verse at a certain point and they put the period where it's not, or they just forget the whole context. So I think like that's something that drives me nuts. And I know my mom brings it up a lot, being a leader, a woman leader in the church, because she has faced things like that and she wants to make sure that it's known that there's more to the story. You can't just, cherry pick, as a lot of people like to do.
Yeah, excellent point. So you're referring to what are called the holiness codes in the New Testament. I
Mhm.
believe there are four of them, and I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure three of them do a vice versa thing. So they begin with women, you need to respect and honor your husband. And they also include, of course, children. You need to respect and honor your parents, and slaves. You need to respect and honor your masters. But then for each set of relationship, they do the vice versa thing. So
Mhm.
masters, you also need to treat your slaves like they're human, like they're a child of God. Um, Parents, you need to not give your kids a reason to hate you, and husbands, you need to love your wife and respect their body, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it can't just go one way.
Mhm.
And I think the implication in what you're saying is that, if women can't be church leaders, then that forces men to be leaders. And what if they don't want to be? What if they're not gifted to be? And so I would add not just having the choice for women or men to be um, whatever they want to be, but that choice should be rooted in what are we really gifted to do,
Mhm.
and to be. Because, yeah, if you're a man and you are gifted to be a father, and your wife makes enough money for you to be a stay-at-home dad, go for it. And it would be horrible if the one person in the relationship gifted to be a parent is not allowed to be, or is looked down for it, especially in the church, because the man is supposed to be the head of the household, or whatever we say about things.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, those gender relationships, and I want to point out too, I guess, that just because you're a man or male doesn't mean you need to be masculine. And
Mhm.
just because you are uh, a female doesn't mean you need to be feminine.
Mhm.
Sex and gender are not actually the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think we sometimes part of this discussion is anyway that sometimes we get those mixed up, that we think you're female, so therefore you must be feminine and you have no leadership qualities whatsoever. That's ridiculous.
I agree. I was gonna point out. I keep forgetting to say it, but I was gonna point out. I've encountered so many people in my life that have been like, when they're going to talk about having children with their spouse, I feel like I hear 9 times out of 10, I hope I have boys because they're easier to raise than girls, right? And that is like one of my biggest pet peeves ever. Because as we know, whether it be through statistics or experience, we know that men, it takes them a little bit longer to mature. Totally fine, right? I think the thing is with between between boys and girls, I should say, is that I feel like we're getting better at it now in the coming generations, raising boys to be better men. But I know that, like, looking back and just like through experience with the men I've encountered in my life, is that people get lazy, right? Because they allow boys to do things and then they don't allow girls to do the same thing because boys will be boys and girls need to set a standard. They need to have a certain reputation. I remember, like, say like I wanted to wear like a short shorts outside and I'm like 16 years old. I remember like my dad would be like, "You're not leaving the house like that." But like my brother can go outside without a shirt on. It's just like I'm not saying I'm gonna take my shirt off, but like I can't even like show my legs. Like I just like not only do we like sexualize girls at such a young age, but we also put such like heavy responsibilities on them at such a young age as well, that I feel like that's why we feel the need to grow up so fast. And for then people to turn around and say it's harder to raise girls, it's because you're actually putting in the work to raise these girls who become, mature women who are able to critically think at a younger age than some boys. So I just like that was just something I wanted to bring up, and it's not even anything that that I'm saying like, oh, men are stupid or men, like it's not even about that. Like it's literally just we need to be better at raising males and boys, from a young age. We need to take our time because they deserve just as much attention as the girls do. They shouldn't just be able to do whatever they want, and then that's when we end up, I mean, you look at like domestic violence or anything like that, a lot of it is male to female. Even though I obviously know that females also abuse men, we have higher percentages the other way around. So that's just like, I think we just need to reframe our mind because even within like, our own culture, Latino culture, we have machismo, and like a man has to be like this manly masculine person. They can't like paint their nails, they can't like wear certain things and wear it the way they want, or be like super clean with the shave and whatever. So it's just like I just feel like we need to put as much energy into raising our men that we do our women.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a great point. I often think about when I pick up my kids from school. Soren gets out before Sebastian, who's the oldest, and so I'll be, just kind of playing around with Soren. Sometimes we're play fighting and tumbling around in the grass, and there's a parent there who's often with their little girl, and they'll be laughing watching us play. But then if the little girl tries to do anything, to play or anything, it's, hey, where are you going? Like, you can't get your dress dirty. You have to stay right here and wait.
Hmm.
Um, and it's crazy to me, but I absolutely understand it because that is, we do put huge expectations upon our women before they're even women. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, and I forget what I was going to transition that into something, but so I mean, one way or another, though, we certainly there's clearly, I think we're agreed, there is there is sexism that needs to be addressed, and
Hmm.
it's often um, disguised as just attempts to be, at least in the church, as attempts to be faithful to the Bible. So let's get to the Bible again, and point out that some of these texts are called texts of terror. So there are some texts of terror about women. There's some about slaves and non-faithful people as well. Perhaps the major ones are about women, though. And they're called texts of terror because they have been used throughout the centuries to essentially terrorize certain groups of people. So I mentioned the one from First Timothy in the intro, and I'll read that one for everyone's sake. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So there are a number of things that we can say about this passage, but I mean, what do we do with it? Right? If we reject the idea of it, what do we do with it? Because it's there.
I know a lot of people come back to this text all the time to try to rub it in people's faces. I mean, I went to a wedding a few years ago where it was just like, we don't want your mom to do the wedding because she's a woman. She shouldn't be. Yeah. And it's just like, come on, grow up. But the whole dressing modestly thing, that's something that I've always struggled with throughout my life. Because I obviously know that there's a line, right, between dressing respectfully, but I think that the way that people say it to young girls is wrong because people say it so that it's like you need to dress modestly so that you're not making our brothers in Christ feel like they're sinning when they're looking at you. And it's like, okay, well, my brothers in Christ need to learn where to keep their eyes, right? Like I should be able to dress the way I want to dress because maybe I feel good in that, right? And my guy friend over here should be able to dress the way he wants to because he probably feels good too. I'm not gonna look him up and down and be like, damn, do a whole 360, like let me get your number, like that's right. They don't tell us about that. They only tell us we need to dress a certain way because of men,
Mhm.
but men are never told vice versa because apparently men can't dress sexy. Totally false. We all know that. I mean, we've all seen Chris Evans, right? Nate would be like, we've all seen Chris Evans and Ryan Gosling. Like, you know, I just like, that's just something that's always, that's another pet peeve of mine. It's just like, cause the way that I was raised was like, you need to dress a certain way because of men. And it's like, well, maybe we need to do a better job at raising the men so that the women can feel safe, right? So I think that that's something that I always connect to that verse. And then what was the end of that verse? What was the other piece of that verse?
That particular one was, but with they should adorn themselves with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. Um, and there was also quietness and full submission. Women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith.
Yeah, I mean, okay. So let's play it out if we're Adam and Eve, right? So God creates Adam, then he creates Eve from Adam's rib, right? Eve's walking around the garden. Something is here tempting her. It's not a man, right? I mean, is it really the form of a snake? Because that's the story we're all told. Is it actually?
Well, it's there's debate about that. It's something on the ground for sure.
Okay. Regardless of what it is, it's not human. If something inhuman is talking to me and telling me like, "Oh, you got to try this," like it'll let you know I'm eating it. I'm gonna be like, "Okay." And then I go back to my man and I'm like, "You got to try this." And he doesn't question it. Who's the one in power here? Okay? Like we've been in power since the beginning and sure people are like, "Oh, well, you tempted the man, blah blah blah." Okay, well the man was tempted. At the end of the day, whose choice was it? It was still Adam's choice.
Mhm.
And I'm not trying to like gaslight people here, but like I am a little bit because we've been given the other narrative for so long that it's always a woman's fault. Sure, am I gonna like probably fight Eve on sight because of the childbirth thing? I'd be like, sis, was it really worth it? Because now we got to go through this immense pain just to give birth. What were you thinking? But you know what? It is what it is. Women are so much stronger because they're able to endure childbirth like that. I mean, you look at like what is it? Like our pain tolerance, it's much higher than men. Um,
Yeah, I mean, except for me. I mean, mine is
of course,
higher
for the
than yours, but
holy
right.
pastor, yeah. 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 Only the chosen few.
That's right.
But yeah, I mean like there's just some of the things in the Bible, does it matter?
What do you mean by that?
Like talking about like modesty and talking about like women submitting to men and just like there's just so many things and like and then we go through the book of Leviticus because sometimes I'll read the book of Leviticus to just remind myself how crazy the Bible can be, and I'll be like, bro,
Yeah,
like these people they had it rough, like to remain clean you can't even breathe,
yeah,
like you can't even look one way or the other. And it's just like we've come such a long way, right? Because culture and religion, it does play a huge part in our daily lives and like what is acceptable and what is not. And I think we just like I say in every podcast episode that we've had, we just lose sight of what's really important, which is just loving each other. Right? Like at the end of the day, who cares what you're wearing? Who cares who you're loving? Who cares who's talking on the pulpit? As long as the word of Christ is being delivered in a loving way, like I think that's what's the most important piece.
yeah.
Who are
So
we
I
to
mean,
tell somebody else like a woman God is calling a woman, like who are we to question that? Who are we to question God's calling in a person's life? Is that not a greater sin? Like being like, well, because you're a woman, it's like, well, I felt called by God to be a pastor.
right.
Are you telling me that, that God is in the wrong here?
Yeah, yeah, and of course that that um that is what they're saying. Although they would argue that what they're saying is actually you just didn't hear correctly. I mean, we could think of Joan of Arc, right? Nowadays, everyone looks back and says, "Hey, hurrah!" But at the time, people were like, who the heck are you? You can't
Mm-hmm.
do this." Um, and so it's, I think, also, I was expecting you to to say, well, if sexism, came first, then we have to remember that the Bible is written by humans. Even if we say it's inspired by God and the Holy Spirit, fine, but that doesn't mean that humans didn't have a part in writing it. And some of these texts might just have gotten a little more uh, tainted than
Mm.
others. Um,
Little
I'll point.
creative freedom.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Like, I think God, I think I misheard that, so let me change it as I write it. Um, and and we can kind of see that here in this passage, just to, because we're using that as an example. He actually gets this wrong. So there are a number of things we can say about it. First of all, in Genesis chapter 1, Adam and Eve are created at the exact same time. It's only Genesis 2 in which Adam is created first, and Adam is deceived, right? He's deceived second, but he's still deceived. We should also point out that Eve wasn't told the rule not to eat the fruit. Adam was told the rule not to eat the fruit. And then it was after that that Eve is created. So whose job is it to make sure no one eats the fruit? It's Adam's job because Eve didn't even hear it. So, there are lots of issues with this passage just to begin with. Like its own biblical interpretation, one could say, is wrong. So there's that. One other thing you said of, what is the lens that we're using to read scripture? And for you, it's love, and I would say for me, it's Christ. You know, is this something that Christ would do or say? And if it's not, then should we as Christians be putting a whole lot of emphasis on it? And so there's Mary, Mother of God, and just imagine Mary, Mother of God, going to Joseph saying, "Hey, you can't get rid of me, even though that's the law, because I had a dream." An angel spoke to me. I mean, what courage does she need to do that? But also
Especially in that
Jesus,
time. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And Jesus has Mary and Martha and the women, of around Jesus. They're the ones who tell us about the resurrection. So from the lens of Christ, there's something wrong with this. And as you mentioned earlier, Esther um, is just one among many women who are lifted up in the Bible. I think you're right. The courage of Esther is such a powerful story. There are of course others as well. I mean, there's Deborah in the Book of Judges, who is a warrior, and she's the leader. Uh, there's the fascinating one. There's also Jael, who uh, kills the enemy leader with what is that called? The thing that you pound down a steak with? A stake. No, it's
Like,
stake. So she kills him by nailing a stake through his head. It's a great story. But there's Jael, and then of course there are a ton of women in the New Testament all over
mhm.
the. So it doesn't even make sense with itself, right? Just looking at the rest of the Bible, it doesn't make sense. And so there are people out there who believe it, who take it literally, who use this against others. But and if you're one of those people out there, okay. But if you're not and you're listening to this, you have permission. You have every reason to say, no, there's something wrong with that interpretation, that traditional interpretation.
Mhm.
I have another long thing to say. Before I get into that, is there anything you wanted to add, Kayla?
Um, maybe just like a little bit, but it's mostly it's nothing long. It's really quick. But I feel like as we look at a lot of like historical figures, especially males through history, there's more than likely a powerful woman by their
Mm,
side through
right.
through it through all the trials and tribulations that they go through, so I feel like we lose sight of that because of the people that write the history books and so on and so forth. So I think we just need to like do a little research and realize like in the face of so many challenges that women are able to keep a level head. And I know that they always say that we're like these emotional beings that put it and it is true, we are emotional and there's nothing to be ashamed of in that, but we also are able to think clearly through our emotions because we suffer from emotions monthly, as everybody knows, and to be able to carry on with our daily lives while we're dealing with that, I think that's kind of like a little training there that men don't have to go through. So
I don't know. It's pretty hard having to live with you every month. So,
mm,
uh,
better than better than you being the woman, trust me.
I this is I say this jokingly, but I also think it's true, and like this reflects poorly upon me. But I think I had a harder time than Danielle when she gave birth to Soren, our second. Is just because I was an emotional, not really an emotional, I was a mental wreck. Like, I could not handle myself. Whereas Danielle was just, hey, the baby's coming. It's it's all good. Um, and she was awesome as always, but I barely even be in the room because I could not handle this. Um, but excellent transition too, because you made me think of Abigail Adams. If you ever read the letters between John Adams and Abigail, oftentimes Abigail would write to John. They loved each other very deeply. You can tell that. But what Abigail would write to John saying, "What are you doing? What are you thinking, John? You're being an idiot. Like, just change your mind." And he did. It's pretty cool. So the story I want to tell is the story of Methodism, and essentially it's the story of Susanna Wesley, uh, who we often forget because when we tell the story of Methodism, we think of John and Charles Wesley, right? But Susanna was their mother, and mother of a lot of kids. Uh, Before I get to Susanna's role, I want to tell different story first. So when John Wesley came over the ocean from England to the colony of Georgia to evangelize the heathen over here, he fell in love with a woman named Sophie Hopkey. Have you heard this story, Kayla? No.
No.
Okay, excellent. So that means probably this is the first time everyone is hearing this story. So Sophie liked John, but wasn't about to marry the guy. John was a very humorless person, plus he was a priest. It's kind of weird. So she became engaged to another person. And what John did in response was the next time Sophie came up to receive Holy Communion, in front of the whole congregation, John Wesley, that great holy man, refused to give her communion. And I can just imagine her standing there holding up the whole line, whispering, "Are you kidding me, John? Like, are you serious right now?" So everyone hated John. He left town and went back to England. So that's that's his relationship with women. So I just wanted to tell that funny story. But the more relevant story is John did not allow women to preach or exhort. They were kind of two different things in the original Methodist societies. And when women started to preach and exhort, John's plan was to shut those pesky women down because the Bible is clear, right? He read passages like First Timothy and thought, well, only men should do the work of the church. And so John's mother, Susanna, comes in and essentially says, John, you're a very bad boy. Didn't I raise you well? Didn't I teach you to give the Holy Spirit a chance? And so John listened to his mother because he had been teaching people that the Holy Spirit is what matters. Listening to the Holy Spirit is what matters, not the rules and regulations that we've set up. So he didn't want to be hypocritical. He also wanted to be a good son. He decided to give the women a chance to go and listen to them. And as he did, he felt the Spirit moving in them and he let them continue. And this is an incredibly important story. You yourself mentioned it earlier. If God calls you, who are we to say, no, God is wrong? And that's what John essentially said. Who was he and who is anyone else to deny what God has decided? So, in other words, John Wesley and the Methodists, that's who we are. We're trying to listen to and trust what God's Spirit is doing now, not 2,000 years ago, which is blankety blank scary for a lot of Christians, right? Because it means change. And I don't care who you are, doing something other than what you feel is right is scary and it's hard. Um, because then you start thinking everything is going to fall apart, right? The world is going to fall apart. The Antichrist is coming if we don't have a foundation. But it certainly seems to me that there's a lot of wisdom in Methodism and what John Wesley taught, especially when it comes to female leadership. So I don't know how much of that story about Susanna and John you knew as a Methodist pastor's kid. But if you've heard it for the first time, what is your response?
Well, love Susanna, so I hope she's doing well. I just think that that's such an important story because it's a step forward that's scary. It's change, like you said, which is always really scary to do, especially like as a whole movement like that. But that's what makes us us, right? I mean, like that's why we have the flame on the cross. So I think like listening to the Holy Spirit is so essential to who we are that to decide that change is not important when we live in a changing world where you know things are becoming more acceptable and it's just different from the narrative that we've been given our whole lives, but that's okay because if it's something that we feel that God has ordained in our lives, why would we not want to accept it? So I think that's just on top of women in leadership roles and are becoming bishops or whatever it may be that they want to do and achieve in their lives. Like I for any woman that's hearing this that feels like they were raised in a household where they were told to bow their head and do as they're told and submit, it's okay to break the rules sometimes if it's something that you feel God's calling you to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I when you said that if it's something that God has ordained you to do, it made me think that whether we're talking about being a leader in the church or in the workplace or whatever else, it should, especially thinking about our next episode, which will be on marriage, that it's probably an important thing to repeat about getting married or just being who we are. Right? That I sometimes think that a lot of people feel as if they're not complete if they don't get married. If and I don't want to speak for women, but I think it's more often women who think they have to become a wife, or else they're somehow not a good person, or they haven't fulfilled their destiny or whatever. And at the end of the day, it's really just what what has God made you to be, and be that thing no matter what anyone else says. Um, and and sometimes there will be, even when we make steps forward, there will be pushback. I mean, in our own history, if anyone wants to fact check us, we will find that when Methodism became its own denomination, we took steps backward and started to refuse to ordain women and let them be leaders in the church. But we also took steps forward again. Some of the offshoots of Methodism were among the first to ordain women, including Sojourner Truth, and other famous women that we know. Um, so, we shouldn't wait for, and this is true for everybody, but we've been saying, especially if there are women listening to us, don't wait for the world to change. Um, just just go ahead, be like Esther and say, maybe it was for such a time as this that I've been put here, and you have every right to listen to that call.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows why we're still in this position of having to talk about sexism and whether or not women can be church leaders? It seems pretty obvious uh, to us, and to those of us who say yes, they can be. It seems pretty obvious. Um, but it's still a thing, and hopefully our fellow young adult women can just be confident in what they feel called to. Are there other words of wisdom we want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. So if you're a woman listening to this and you're looking for a sign, this is it. This is it.
Nice. I once put on our church sign, if you're looking for a sign from God, this is
I saw,
it. But
I saw that. That was great.
well, excellent, good work. We don't always take a stand on this podcast because um this podcast is intended to just give young adults the space to explore, to know whatever they're thinking, that there's validity to it, and come to your own conclusions and stuff. But egalitarianism and equality, especially in the church, are certainly issues that we don't want to mess around with. So we invite people to explore, of course, but we really hope, at least on this issue, you'll come around to agreeing with us. And as always, if you still have questions or concerns, especially if you feel like you are a victim of sexism, whether it be in the church or otherwise, please feel free to reach out to us. Even if you don't live anywhere near Charlton, Mass, we want to be here for you as a support. So uh, we'd love for you to subscribe to our podcast, tell your friends, find all our episodes wherever you find your podcast. Check in at the end of this month for our next episode on marriage. Until next time, we will say goodbye. Let's say goodbye.
Bye.
And keep it holy, friends.